There are some creatures in nature that are rather horrific. Some of these are obvious enough, with large claws or fangs or a ghastly visage of some kind. Yet these are fairly cheap and obvious villains. Effective enough, but lacking that certain subtlety that elevates horror from simple shock to creeping dread. Sometimes, though, one can stumble across truly dreadful things lurking in the most unexpected of places. One of the more unlikely monsters is found among the beetles. The genus Meloe within the family Meloidae are rather unusual insects commonly known as oil beetles. Upon first glance, an oil beetle hardly looks like a beetle at all. The elytra are greatly reduced, and the hind wings are generally absent altogether. The abdomen is almost comically bloated, and the overall shape is oddly proportioned. If the beetle is a male, it has an odd kink in its antennae. Not quite a joint, so much as a strangely incongruous segment that skews the rest of the antenna in another direction. The overall effect is almost cartoonish, from a certain point of view. It is as if a child's drawing of a random bug came to life, and one wonders how the ungainly creature can even survive in the wild. The unsettling iridescence about the body might be a clue. Such eye-catching coloration often serves as a warning to would-be predators. Indeed, there is something almost malevolent about the creature as one looks more closely. This child's drawing seems just a little too dark and menacing somehow. Indeed, there is a certain underlying logic to such a sense of foreboding. If you encounter a creature in the wild and there is no armor, no speed, no camouflage, and no obvious fangs or claws, you have to ask just what is keeping the thing alive. What dreadful ace might be up the proverbial sleeve? With the oil beetles, it's a doozy. To properly explain, let us turn our attention to a distant cousin to these unusual insects. The ladybug is a very familiar beetle and is generally regarded as beneficial and aesthetically pleasing. It's probably one of the more favored insects overall, despite the occasional problems that arise. One such problem is seen when one handles a ladybug just a little too roughly, or perhaps if one simply catches it in a bad mood. The result is a yellowish stain of noxious fluid, a defensive measure by the otherwise unassuming little beetle. Now one might be tempted to speculate that the creature has relieved itself using the offending hand as a sort of latrine. The truth of the matter is somewhat more disturbing. The ladybugs, like many other insect species, defend themselves by reflex bleeding. That is, they purposefully bleed all over their intended target to persuade it to leave them alone. The hemolymph of a ladybug is mildly toxic and apparently quite bitter. Thus, it serves as a means of discouraging a would-be diner. Granted, purposefully opening a little wound to let some blood out seems like a rather extreme strategy, but insects are fairly resilient in the face of injury. It causes no great inconvenience to the creature in the end. Returning to the oil beetles, one can guess that these insects also engage in reflex bleeding as a defensive measure. They are named oil beetles because their hemolymph is fairly oily. When provoked, they bleed from joints on their legs. These joints include small patches of particularly weak exoskeleton that is easily split open, and such breaks heal rapidly afterward. One might speculate that the distended proportions of the oil beetle might allow for a particularly large reserve of hemolymph. In these beetles, the hemolymph contains a chemical known as Cantharidin. It is difficult to overstate the toxicity of this substance. It is classified as an extremely hazardous substance in the United States, and its use and production are closely regulated. The danger of the stuff becomes apparent if you happen to get any significant amount on your skin. It causes the rapid development of painful blisters. There are not many chemicals that act as vesicants or blistering agents, as it takes something fairly special to get through the natural defenses of human skin. Mustard gas would be one of the more famous examples of a vesicant. The way Cantharidin works is rather complex and fairly insidious in its way. To briefly explain, all cells contain proteases, that is, special enzymes that break down proteins. Cells are normally always producing proteins as a part of their normal functions and breaking them down to prevent unhealthy accumulations. The system is both complicated and subtle, maintaining a delicate biochemical balance. Cantharidin effectively throws a wrench into this system. It causes epidermal cells to release certain proteases that gnaw away at the connections that normally bind the cells together and connect them to underlying tissues. This leads to a separation between the epidermis and the dermis. This gap fills with extracellular fluid and appears as a translucent bump on the skin surface. In other words, a blister. It gets worse, though. Cantharidin also hacks into certain pathways that regulate cell division and cell death. The end result is apoptosis, or programmed cell death. Basically, this chemical throws a wrench in the cell's machinery and triggers its self-destruct mechanism. This sophisticated biochemical manipulation has led to the use of cantharidin as a treatment to remove warts and a few similar lesions. There are also a number of scientists investigating its potential as a form of cancer treatment, though results seem to be murky thus far. There is a more traditional use of this substance as a medicine of sorts. There's a species of Meloid beetle, Lita vesicatoria, which looks like a fairly normal beetle. It is metallic green and fairly slender, and like other Meloids, it bleeds the usual cantharidin cocktail. Unlike the other Meloids, it was historically harvested as a source of this chemical for use as an aphrodisiac. The medicine in question has sometimes been referred to by the same title as the beetle itself, which is commonly known as the Spanish fly. Why anybody would use a highly toxic blistering agent as a love potion is anybody's guess, but people aren't always known for their good sense. In any case, if you disturb an oil beetle, it will open little wounds on its leg joints to bleed out a poison that raises blisters and makes cells terminate themselves. It seems almost reminiscent of the corrosive acid blood seen in certain science fiction monsters, though this mechanism is somewhat more elegant. All of the beetles in the family Meloidae have some amount of cantharidin in their hemolymph and will defend themselves with reflex bleeding as necessary. This is why they are commonly known as blister beetles. As if this chemical warfare wasn't unsettling enough, the life history of these beetles makes them even more disturbing. Every known Meloid beetle undergoes a form of hypermetamorphosis, where at least two of the larval stages are remarkably different from one another. This is because of the surprisingly different life of the first larval stage compared to those that follow after. The first larval stage is known as a triungulin, and it is a slender, almost athletic little creature with well-developed legs. As might be expected, these newly hatched larvae are quite small, and their entire purpose in life is to hitch a ride. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let us focus on just one species of Meloid to use as a basic example. Meloe franciscanus is native to the American Southwest. Its habitat consists mainly of sand dunes with the occasional patch of vegetation. The beetles get by well enough, feeding on plants like the spotted locoweed, Astragalus lentiginosus. Their oily, poisonous blood and a willingness to bleed from time to time tend to keep them off the menu of most of the local creatures. Sometime after mating, the female lays her eggs in a shallow burrow underground, generally near a suitable vegetation patch. The eggs develop in the sandy earth, insulated well enough from the desert heat. It is worth noting that there are often hundreds of eggs laid together like this. No great surprise considering the ample abdomen of their mother. When these eggs hatch, the triungulin larvae emerge and climb up a suitable plant stalk. They cluster together in a reddish-brown clump and wait. As they wait, they are giving off a chemical signal to attract their intended target. There are a number of bee species in the world, and many of them are solitary. One of the local species is Habropoda pallida, commonly known as the white-faced bee. The scientific name roughly translates into the pale creature with dainty feet. Make of that what you will. These bees are fairly pale, and I suppose they look dainty enough, though this is of little concern to the waiting beetle larvae. Eventually, if these larvae are lucky, they manage to draw in a male bee. The chemical they have been giving off is an approximation of the pheromones of a female bee of the same species. So the male approaches to investigate, and as soon as he lands on the plant, the waiting larvae rapidly climb onto him. The poor fellow is likely aware that he's been duped, but the little buggers won't let go, so he has little choice but to fly off and continue on his way with a number of tiny passengers. With a bit of luck, he might eventually find his way to a more genuine female bee and do the sorts of things that tend to make the next generation of bees happen. While the amorous pair are suitably distracted, at least some of the little beetle larvae climb off of him and onto her. The expectant mother digs a suitable burrow for her offspring before collecting a suitable supply of pollen and nectar to properly provision her progeny. In the normal course of events, she would lay her eggs and seal the larvae away with a suitable stockpile of nectar and pollen, enough food to carry them to maturity before they emerged as adult bees. Alas, the beetle larvae disembark from her body while she is in the burrow and take over the home. The bee eggs and larvae are undesired competition, of course, so they are among the first things to be eaten. After that, these little parasites take up residence in their place. They molt into pale, corpulent grubs as they grow. No need for transport or deception now, after all. All they need to do now is eat and grow. Eventually they pupate, and a little while later, oil beetles climb up from the earth rather than bees. All of the Meloid beetles develop roughly in this manner. Most will parasitize solitary bees of one sort or another. Some are very species-specific, while others are more generalist. Some work in clusters, while others seek out their victims as individual larvae. Still, the basic pattern is fairly similar throughout the family. An entire family of beetles that have toxic, corrosive blood undergo radical metamorphosis and develop as parasites. I swear I have heard of something similar somewhere in the darker corners of sci-fi. They even have a dark, glossy exoskeleton with unusual and unsettling proportions. Such worrisome little monsters are all too common in the obscure corners of the natural world.